Hey everyone, welcome to Another World. I'm Alex, and with me as always is my co-host and fellow economics enthusiast.
Rowan here, and I've got to say, I'm really excited about today's topic.
You should be. What if I told you the biggest conflict of our century isn't happening on any battlefield? It's playing out in research labs, boardrooms, and yes, even in your smartphone.
Hmm, you're talking about the United States and China, aren't you?
Exactly. We're diving into what might be the most consequential economic rivalry of our time. $690 billion in trade just last year, but underneath all that money is a fascinating story of competition, cooperation, and controversy.
Pretty wild when you think about it. These two massive economies that seem so intertwined are now, what should we call it, frenemies?
That's actually a pretty good way to put it. Today, we're going to explore how these economic superpowers went from being close trading partners to technological rivals. We'll look at everything from semiconductor wars to artificial intelligence races.
And I hear we've got some surprising numbers about intellectual property theft too.
Oh, we absolutely do. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. But that's just one piece of this incredible puzzle. Ready to dive in?
Lead the way.
Let me take you back to 2001. Remember where you were then, Rowan?
I was probably worried about my math homework. Why that year specifically?
Because that's when everything changed. China joined the World Trade Organization, and it was like opening the floodgates of global commerce. You know how sometimes you look at old photos and think, wow, things were so different then?
Yeah, totally different world. But I'm curious, what exactly did everyone expect to happen when China joined?
The prevailing thought was that bringing China into the global trading system would encourage it to become more like Western market economies. The idea was, if we trade together, we'll grow together.
And I'm guessing that's not exactly how things played out.
Not quite. See, what actually happened was fascinating. China did embrace international trade, but on its own terms. They maintained their state-directed capitalism while becoming the world's factory. Western companies got access to cheaper manufacturing, but they also had to play by China's rules.
Like, what kind of rules are we talking about?
Well, many foreign companies had to form joint ventures with Chinese firms to operate there. They often had to share their technology too. It was kind of like, imagine being invited to someone's house for dinner, but they insist on learning your secret family recipes before letting you in.
That's a pretty clever way of putting it, but surely the benefits must have been huge for both sides, right?
Oh, absolutely. In the early years, it seemed like a win-win. American consumers got cheaper goods, companies saw their profits soar, and China lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. The numbers were staggering. Trade between the two countries grew about 20 times larger than it was in 1990.
20 times? That's incredible, but something clearly changed along the way.
You're right. By the 2010s, concerns started growing. Western companies realized they weren't just helping build a market, they were helping create their future competition. Chinese companies that started as manufacturing partners were becoming serious rivals.
I can see how that would make people nervous. Was there a specific moment when things started to shift?
It was more of a gradual awakening. Think of it like teaching someone to play chess. At first, you're just showing them the moves, but eventually they start winning games. China began moving up the value chain from making simple products to competing in high-tech industries.
And now we're seeing the consequences of that transformation.
Exactly. What started as a straightforward trade relationship has evolved into something much more complex. We've got two economic giants, deeply intertwined but increasingly wary of each other. It's like they're dancing together but stepping on each other's toes more and more often.
You know what's really interesting to me? How different this is from what everyone predicted back in 2001. It's almost like we were all a bit naive about how this would play out.
That's such a good point. The assumption was that economic integration would lead to political convergence. Instead, we've got this fascinating situation where two very different systems are competing to prove their model works better.
And I guess that brings us to where we are today. With all these tensions over technology, trade, and economic influence.
Precisely. That 2001 moment set the stage for everything we're seeing now. The semiconductor battles, the artificial intelligence race, the debates over economic security, it all traces back to those early decisions and assumptions.
It's kind of like watching a slow-motion transformation that nobody quite predicted.
And that transformation is still ongoing. The really interesting part is that neither side can simply walk away. They're too interconnected. It's not just about trade anymore, it's about competing visions for the future of the global economy.
Speaking of competing visions, there's one battlefield that really captures this whole rivalry perfectly: semiconductors. These tiny chips are basically the brains of everything digital we use today.
Right, our phones, computers, cars, pretty much anything electronic needs these chips. But why are they such a big deal in this economic rivalry?
Well, imagine if one country controlled most of the world's oil supply. That would give them enormous power, right? Now semiconductors are like the new oil, but even more critical for the modern economy.
And from what I understand, The United States has been pretty aggressive about keeping its edge in this area lately.
Absolutely. The US has put in place some of the strictest export controls we've ever seen. They're basically saying to China, you can't buy our most advanced chips and you can't get the equipment to make them either.
That seems pretty intense. How has China responded to that?
They're pouring massive amounts of money into developing their own chip industry. We're talking about $150 billion through 2030. But here's the fascinating part. Money alone might not be enough.
Why not? That seems like an enormous investment.
Because making advanced chips is incredibly complex. It's not just about having the right machines, it's about having decades of experience and knowledge. Think of it like trying to create a five-star restaurant. You can buy all the best equipment, but without the right expertise and experience, you still might not get those Michelin stars.
And I guess there's also the whole Taiwan situation, right? I've heard they're super important in all this.
Oh, Taiwan is absolutely crucial. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company makes some of the most advanced chips in the world. They're like the master chefs in our restaurant analogy.
So we've got the US trying to maintain its lead, China investing heavily to catch up, and Taiwan caught in the middle. That sounds like a recipe for tension.
Exactly. And what makes this even more complex is that these chips aren't just about economics anymore. They're about national security, military capabilities, artificial intelligence development, everything.
I've also heard that making these advanced chips requires incredibly precise conditions, like almost impossibly precise.
You're absolutely right. The most advanced chip factories need to be cleaner than a hospital operating room. The machines need to be accurate to within a few nanometers. That's like trying to draw a perfect circle smaller than a virus.
That really puts the challenge into perspective. But isn't there a risk that all these restrictions could backfire? Like pushing China to develop alternatives faster?
That's one of the big debates right now. Some experts argue that these restrictions will just motivate China to invest even more heavily in domestic development. Others say the technology gap is simply too wide to close quickly.
It's kind of ironic. We spent decades building these global supply chains and now we're kind of unraveling them.
It's what some people call strategic decoupling. The idea isn't to completely separate the economies, but to carefully control the most critical technologies. Think of it like a couple that decides to keep separate bank accounts while still living together.
That's actually a pretty good analogy. So what happens next in this silicon showdown?
Well, the US has launched something called the CHIPS Act, investing billions in domestic semiconductor production. China is doubling down on its own chip industry, and companies everywhere are trying to figure out how to navigate these new restrictions.
Sounds like this technological Cold War is just getting started.
And the really interesting part is that unlike the original Cold War, these economies are still deeply connected. They're competing and cooperating at the same time, which makes this whole situation so unique in historical terms.
You know, there's another layer to this story that really shows how complicated this relationship has become: intellectual property rights. And the numbers here are staggering.
Oh yeah? How staggering are we talking about?
Well, according to U.S. estimates, American companies are losing somewhere between $200 and $600 billion every year to intellectual property theft.
Wait, every year? That's an enormous range, though. Why such a big difference between the low and high estimates?
That's actually a great question. It's really hard to put an exact number on stolen ideas. Think about it like trying to count how many people are humming your favorite song without paying for it, but on a massive industrial scale.
And I'm guessing this isn't just about copying movies or music anymore?
Not at all. We're talking about industrial design, scientific research, manufacturing processes, even entire business strategies. It's like someone secretly watching you perfect a recipe for years, then opening an identical restaurant next door.
That must drive companies crazy. But how exactly does this theft happen? I mean, it's not like someone's walking out with blueprints under their coat, right?
Well, sometimes it's actually that obvious, but usually it's more sophisticated. You've got cyber hacking, corporate espionage, and something really interesting called forced technology transfers.
Forced technology transfers? That sounds, well, forced.
That's because it is. Remember how we talked about foreign companies having to share technology to access Chinese markets? Many companies feel they have to choose between sharing their intellectual property or losing access to the world's largest market.
So it's kind of like pay to play, but with your company's secrets instead of money?
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. China argues that this is just normal business practice, that Western companies are willing participants who benefit from market access.
But I'm guessing Western companies see it differently?
They absolutely do. From their perspective, it's like being asked to train your future competition. You might get short-term profits, but you're potentially creating a rival who could eventually put you out of business.
That's fascinating, and kind of explains why some companies are starting to rethink their relationship with China, doesn't it?
Precisely. But here's the twist. Many companies still can't resist the allure of the Chinese market. It's too big to ignore, so they're trying to find ways to protect their most valuable intellectual property while still doing business there.
How's that working out for them?
It's a real balancing act. Some companies are keeping their most advanced research and development outside of China. Others are developing China-specific technologies that they're more comfortable sharing, but it's getting harder to maintain that balance.
You know what I find really interesting? How this must affect innovation itself. Like, are companies becoming more secretive, less willing to collaborate?
That's such an insightful point. We're seeing companies become much more careful about who they partner with and what they share. Some are even creating separate research teams for different markets. It's changing the whole landscape of global innovation.
But surely China is doing its own innovation too, right? They can't just be copying everything.
Oh, absolutely. China is becoming an innovation powerhouse in its own right. They're leading in areas like digital payments, certain green technologies, and some aspects of artificial intelligence. That's what makes this situation so complex. It's not just about copying anymore.
So we're moving from a story of copying to one of competing innovation.
Exactly. And that's really the heart of this intellectual property battle. It's not just about protecting past innovations, it's about who will lead the innovations of tomorrow. Both sides are racing to develop the technologies that will shape our future. You know what fascinates me most about this whole situation? We're watching something completely new in economic history, this careful untangling of two massive economies while trying not to break anything in the process.
Like trying to separate two pieces of tape that have been stuck together for decades.
That's actually a perfect analogy. And just like with tape, if you pull too quickly, you risk tearing both pieces. What we're seeing now is this incredibly delicate process called strategic decoupling.
I keep hearing that term, but what exactly makes it strategic rather than just regular decoupling?
Well, it's not about cutting all ties. Instead, countries are being very selective about which economic connections they maintain and which ones they slowly unwind. Think of it like editing your social media friends list, but with trillion-dollar consequences.
So we're not talking about a complete economic divorce?
Not at all. Take electric vehicles, for example. While the US is reducing dependence on Chinese batteries, they're still happy to sell Tesla cars in China. It's about choosing where to maintain connections and where to create distance.
But isn't this incredibly complicated? I mean, modern supply chains are so interconnected.
They absolutely are. And that's what makes this so fascinating. Companies are having to completely reimagine their supply chains. Some are moving production to countries like Vietnam or India. It's called friendshoring.
Friendshoring, that's an interesting term.
Right? It's this idea that you shift your business to countries that share your values and strategic interests. But here's the really interesting part. It's incredibly expensive and time-consuming to do this.
I can imagine. You can't just pick up a factory and move it overnight.
Exactly. And some companies are finding out the hard way that building new supply chains isn't just about geography. You need skilled workers, reliable infrastructure, supportive regulations. It's like trying to recreate an entire ecosystem.
So are we seeing any success stories in this decoupling process?
Yes, but they're very specific. Japan, for instance, successfully reduced its dependence on China for rare earth minerals after a diplomatic crisis in 2010. But it took years and massive government support.
That makes me wonder, beyond the issue, are governments playing a bigger role in business decisions now?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing something that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Governments actively directing where and how companies invest. They're offering subsidies, tax breaks, even direct funding to reshape supply chains.
That sounds expensive.
It is, but governments are viewing it as a national security investment. They're willing to pay more for security and stability. It's like paying extra for insurance. You hope you never need it, but you want it there just in case.
But surely this must be affecting prices for everyday consumers?
That's one of the big concerns. This strategic decoupling could mean the end of the era of ultra-cheap goods we've all gotten used to. Companies are already warning that more resilient supply chains mean higher costs.
So we're kind of choosing security over savings?
In many ways, yes, but it's not just about security. It's about reshaping the entire global economic architecture. We're moving from a world optimized for efficiency to one optimized for resilience.
That's quite a shift. Do you think most people realize how big these changes are?
Probably not yet. It's like climate change. The effects are gradual but profound. We might not notice day to day, but when we look back in 10 years, the economic landscape could be completely different.
And I'm guessing there's no going back to the way things were?
That's what makes this moment so historic. We're watching the end of one economic era and the beginning of another. The really interesting question is, what comes next?
Let's talk about where this rivalry is heading next, because the real competition is just beginning in some incredible new areas. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, green technology, these aren't just buzzwords, they're the new front lines.
You know, it's interesting you mention AI. We've seen both countries making huge claims about their capabilities. How do they really stack up?
It's fascinating, actually. Both are approaching AI development completely differently. The US has this vibrant private sector ecosystem with companies like OpenAI and Google leading the charge. China's taking a more state-directed approach, but they've got some serious advantages in data collection.
Right, because they have more people and fewer privacy restrictions.
Exactly. Think of AI like a growing child. It needs data to learn from. China's ability to collect and use massive amounts of data is like having the world's biggest library to learn from. But the US still leads in the fundamental research and specialized chips needed to run these AI systems.
And what about quantum computing? I keep hearing it's going to change everything, but I'm not really sure how.
Quantum computing is like giving a calculator to someone who's been counting on their fingers. It could solve problems in hours that would take traditional computers millions of years. Both countries know that whoever cracks this first gets an enormous advantage.
In what way? What could they actually do with it?
Well, imagine being able to break any encryption, simulate complex molecular structures for new materials or drugs, or optimize entire city traffic systems in real time. The applications are mind-boggling, which is why both countries are pouring billions into research.
Sounds like whoever wins this race gets a pretty big advantage.
And that's exactly why it's become so competitive, but here's where it gets really interesting. The green technology race. Both countries are betting big on renewable energy, but for different reasons.
Let me guess. China wants to dominate the market and the US wants to reduce dependence on foreign energy?
Close. China sees green tech as a way to solve its pollution problems while also becoming the world's leading supplier of everything from solar panels to electric vehicles. The US is trying to rebuild its manufacturing base around clean technology.
So it's like they're racing to the same finish line but taking different paths?
That's a great way to put it. And the stakes are enormous. We're talking about reshaping the entire global energy system. Whoever leads this transition could dominate the 21st century economy the way oil producers dominated the 20th.
But surely they must be working together on some of this stuff. I mean, climate change affects everyone.
That's one of the great ironies of our time. Both countries know they need to cooperate on global challenges like climate change, but they're also determined to win the race to solve them. It's like two people trying to put out a fire while arguing over who owns the water hose.
That doesn't sound very efficient.
It's not. And that's what makes this next phase of competition so crucial. These technologies could either bring us closer together through cooperation or push us further apart through competition.
So what do you think will happen? Will one side win all these races?
You know what's fascinating? We might end up with different winners in different areas. China might lead in green manufacturing, while the US leads in quantum computing. The real question is whether they can find ways to share these advances for the benefit of everyone.
It's kind of amazing to think that the future of humanity might depend on how well these two countries figure out how to compete and cooperate at the same time.
And that's really the key point. This isn't just about who builds the better technology, but it's about whether we can find new ways for different systems to work together in an increasingly complex world. You know what really strikes me about this whole economic rivalry? It's not just about trade balances or market access anymore. We're watching two different visions of the future compete in real time.
And neither side can really afford to completely walk away from the other, right?
Exactly. They're locked in this fascinating dance of competition and cooperation. The technology race, the supply chain shifts, the intellectual property battles, it's all reshaping how the global economy works.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Two massive economies trying to gain advantages while still staying connected. Though I have to wonder, what does this mean for the rest of the world?
That's such a crucial question. Every country is now having to navigate between these two economic powerhouses. It's like the whole world is recalibrating its economic relationships.
And I guess the really interesting part is that we don't know how it ends. This isn't like the old Cold War with its clear ideological lines.
No, it's much more complex. We're seeing the emergence of a new kind of global competition, one where success might actually depend on finding the right balance between rivalry and partnership.
So what's your take on where this heads next?
I think we're entering an era where the biggest challenge won't be about who wins, but whether these two economic giants can find ways to compete without destroying the global systems they both depend on. The future might not belong to either the US or China, but to whoever figures out how to turn this rivalry into something that benefits everyone.
Thanks for listening. If you liked, don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.